One of the first people to act was a local repeater trustee. For those unfamiliar with amateur radio, repeater owners invest significant amounts of time, money, and effort maintaining these systems. Although repeaters operate on public amateur frequencies, trustees are responsible for maintaining order on their equipment. When necessary, they can ask disruptive or unauthorized users to stay off their machines. That's exactly what happened. The next time John appeared on the repeater, the trustee responded calmly. There was no yelling, no insults, no public humiliation, just a direct message. John, we need to talk. The conversation moved off the air. John was informed that the call sign he was using did not belong to him. He was told the local operators knew exactly where it had come from. He was asked to stop using the repeater. Immediately, John denied very little. Whether it was shock or resignation, he seemed to understand the game was over. He left the conversation quietly, but word continued to spread. Another repeater owner contacted him. The message was essentially the same. You are not welcome on this machine. Another local mentor, an Elmer who had helped countless new operators over the years, spoke with him as well. Unlike the others, the Elmer wasn't angry. He was disappointed. He knew how much John loved radio. He knew John had the ability to become a legitimate amateur operator if he simply applied himself. The tragedy wasn't that John lacked knowledge. The tragedy was that he had convinced himself he couldn't succeed, honestly. That disappointment was perhaps harder to hear than outright anger. John wasn't being rejected because he loved amateur radio. He was being rejected because he had chosen deception instead of perseverance. As more repeater owners became aware of the situation, the same decision was repeated. One after another, John lost access to the local systems. No formal FCC action had been taken. No citations had been issued. No fines had appeared in the mail. Instead, the amateur radio community handled the matter the way it often handled problems during that era. Quietly, directly, locally. By now, John understood there was nowhere left to hide. Every repeater he had once enjoyed now represented another reminder that the borrowed identity had collapsed. The forged license hanging on the wall suddenly looked very different. Only weeks earlier, it had represented acceptance. Now it represented a mistake that everyone knew about. But the final chapter of the story had not yet been written. One local operator decided that radio conversations were no longer enough. If the deception had started face-to-face among friends, perhaps it needed to end the same way. So one afternoon, a car pulled into John's driveway. A man walked to the front door, knocked, and waited. There are moments in life when everything changes, not gradually, not over weeks or months, in a single instant. For John, that moment came with a knock on the front door. There was no dramatic police raid, no flashing blue lights, no federal agents wearing windbreakers with large yellow letters across the back. Just another amateur radio operator, someone from the local community, someone who had finally decided that enough was enough. John answered the door. The conversation that followed wasn't loud. There was no argument, no threats, no profanity. There didn't need to be. The facts spoke for themselves. The visitor explained that everyone now knew the truth. The call sign belonged to another operator. The license on the wall wasn't real. The local repeater owners had compared notes. The call book had confirmed everything. There was nowhere left to hide. For a few moments, the room was probably quieter than it had ever been. The radio sat nearby. The forged license still hung on the wall. What had once looked like proof now looked like evidence. John understood. There was no clever explanation left. No misunderstanding, no technicality, no one was accusing the wrong person. His borrowed identity had reached the end of the road. One of the remarkable things about this story is what didn't happen. No one called the evening news. No one tried to publicly embarrass him over the repeater. No one made him the subject of club gossip for years afterward. Instead, the amateur radio community handled the matter the same way many close-knit communities handle difficult situations: directly, privately, respectfully. That doesn't mean they ignored what happened. Far from it. The consequences were real. John had already been told to stay off several local repeaters. The operators who maintained those systems no longer trusted him. That trust, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Unlike equipment, trust can't simply be repaired with new parts. It has to be earned. Transmission by transmission. Conversation by conversation. Day after day. John had spent months building a reputation under someone else's name. And one afternoon, that reputation disappeared. He was left with only his own decisions. Some people might wonder why no one immediately contacted the FCC. The answer lies partly in the era. During the early 1990s, FCC enforcement resources were limited. Cases involving harmful interference, pirate broadcasting, or public safety communications generally received far greater attention than a local impersonation that had already been stopped by the community. That doesn't mean what John did wasn't serious. It absolutely was. Knowingly transmitting under another person's call sign violated FCC regulations. Using a fraudulent amateur radio license could have resulted in additional legal consequences. Had the matter been referred to federal authorities, the outcome might have been very different. But before anyone took that step, the local amateur radio community had already solved the problem. John stopped transmitting almost immediately. The microphone that had become part of his evening routine remained in its cradle. The repeater frequencies grew strangely quiet. Operators who had become accustomed to hearing the borrowed call sign noticed its sudden absence. Nobody had to ask why. Everyone already knew. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The silence continued. Some stories end with dramatic courtroom scenes. Others end with newspaper headlines. This one ended with something far simpler. Silence. The forged license eventually lost whatever meaning it once held. Whether it stayed on the wall for a time or quietly disappeared isn't important. What mattered was that it no longer represented acceptance. It represented regret. The saddest part of the story isn't that John was caught. The saddest part is that he probably could have become a legitimate amateur radio operator. He already possessed many of the skills. He understood operating procedures. He understood courtesy. He understood how repeaters worked. He understood technical discussions. He had spent years educating himself simply by listening. The one thing standing between him and a genuine call sign wasn't ability. It was confidence. He believed the examination was impossible. He believed Morse code would defeat him. He convinced himself there was no realistic path forward. Instead of asking for help, he accepted defeat before ever taking the test. That's a lesson that extends far beyond amateur radio. Sometimes our greatest obstacle isn't the challenge itself. It's the story we tell ourselves about the challenge. John spent years believing he couldn't pass. No one can say whether that belief was true because he never gave himself the opportunity to find out. The irony is impossible to ignore. He successfully learned everything necessary to sound like an experienced amateur operator. He mastered procedures, operating etiquette, technical vocabulary, net participation, proper identification practices. He invested countless hours learning the hobby. Yet the one step that truly mattered, the examination, was the only step he refused to attempt.